Well, with mine, obviously, there's an interest in story and narrative, and the kind of data that presents itself. But as a trained sociologist, my primary work has been in documenting issues concerning women in various ways, especially with Daughters Are Diamonds and the kind of debate that came off the causes I developed around that book on feminism, on women negotiating the space within a democratic space, but also the idea that within a traditional space, women cross a threshold, and then all autonomous decision-making is stripped away from them in many cases, and what it means to carry various labels as a woman. And throughout those kinds of topics, throughout writing about women in those spaces, I knew that the story of violence was a compelling and necessary, actually, that it demanded being written. And I started writing the story of abuse, about 4 years ago, and SoPhia was born. We've just launched it a 2 months ago. But really, these stories can be spoken about at sort of scientifically unpacked. And how much of a shift are you really going to create in consciousness unless these stories start to be spoken about, read in a context where it can be engaged on a larger scale with a larger readership. And this is the reason for actually writing fiction for what is the first time in my case.
Well, I grew up in a very violent place, and I witnessed people getting attacked all the time. And so I was always very aware of how vulnerable I felt and how difficult it was to be living in that place at that time. But at the same time, I was watching a lot of violence from behind a large, often locked gate. And I was sort of in the place, but I was also separated from a lot of the violence. And I remember, it would be Sunday afternoon and after lunch, and people would be kind of hanging out and drinking and, listening to good music or whatever. And suddenly there would be, this great noise outside, and everybody would rush to the street and watch what was happening. And often, a lot of those times, it was a woman being beaten. And sort of everybody was kind of coming out to watch and see what would happen. And people would laugh and they would clap and they'd be horrified, and then they'd go back to their homes. But I always wanted to write about the role of the witness in times like that. And that's why the book is about, the narrator is a witness of violence. And so I've always kind of wanted to explore what the witness's role is, what you do. Do you go out and speak out? Do you laugh at the scene and then just walk back to your home and say, boys will be boys, men will be men, that sort of thing? Or do you actually speak out? So I wrote this book just to kind of look at that.
I'm going to expand a bit on that next question. Now I finished both your books recently, and so I had time to compare them, and I was surprised at how similar they both were, because they dealt with different communities and different kinds of relationships. We have in Shafinaaz, in your book, a married couple, and then a couple going out in your book, Kagiso. But so it surprised me at first that there were similarities. I didn't think that there would be, but I realized that abuse and domestic abuse will obviously have universal similarities in them, and they follow patterns and cycles. And there was something that bothered me when I read it, and maybe you guys can just comment on it or maybe explain it to me, is that these victims go through these very traumatic experiences of abuse. And, well, obviously they have to speak out about it, and that obviously takes a lot of courage as well. But I'm interested in knowing why then, that they've been through this, and the victims themselves, why then are they further victimized? And so you've mentioned just now that these men would come outside and laugh at them, or, it would be like a big spectacle. And Shafinaaz, in your book, and this might be a bit of a spoiler, but sorry, Zareen's husband walks out on her, and the family are all they blame Zareen, basically. They say, oh, well, she used all of his money. money, and she wasted his money, and that's why he left her. And it couldn't have been him because he's an upstanding man, a citizen, upstanding citizen in the community. And in your book, Kagiso, Moipone is just looked down upon as this girl who tried to get our hero of our community, and he can't do anything wrong. I mean, he's the first boy in the family anyway, so he could never do anything wrong. And so there's this tendency, I feel, to blame the victim, and generally the victim is the woman. And I'm trying to understand this because this is a cycle, and I see this happening all the time. And maybe you could perhaps comment on it. Lisa, you've done counseling, and Shafinaaz, you have your sociology background. Just perhaps to comment on why then is the victim further victimized, and why is it so, and why do we blame the woman all the time?
I think we have to look at the discourse around violence, and specifically gender-based violence. And I'm thinking of, especially with the piece that Kagiso read now, and in so much of the data you get this notion of, is it acceptable for society to, for somebody to go around saying, well, she needs to be raped in order to be fixed, how do we speak in society without a sort of consciousness and awareness of how wrong it is if you're perpetuating violence against someone, if you're actually oppressing someone in whatever situation. So victim blaming draws from a strong sense of denialism. I'm always struck by an immense sense of trauma, immense trauma that operates throughout society. And there's this kind of trauma flinging that goes on. So we transfer trauma through our discourse, through our practices, through the way that we speak, through the language that we use, through blaming the victim, through insisting that she must have done something to deserve this. It doesn't just happen. And there's a strong sense of denialism. So violence and abuse happens somewhere out there, and somebody caused it to happen to themselves. She must have done something to deserve it. She had to be punished, disciplined, or fixed. And so she was hurt, mutilated, or raped, because somebody out there is taking it upon themselves as a sort of pseudo self-righteousness to fix, to correct. We talk of also so-called corrective rape. The idea that lesbian women need to be fixed is a very problematic and pseudo self-righteous assumption taken on in a very patriarchal in a very patriarchal context. So all of this needs to come back to understanding where the discourse begins, what it means, how problematic it is, and how it actually needs to be adjusted. It's not correct to say, she needs to be raped in order to be fixed. It's not correct to say that the victim must have done something to deserve this. And the self-victimization is even more explicit when she says, next time I'll do something better. What did I do to deserve this? Next time I'll make the tea better, I'll hang your shirts better, I'll make sure the kids are quiet. We're transferring trauma almost on a mudslinging kind of dimension. And I'm immensely struck by this notion.
Well, in this particular community, in this book, Basi is this upstanding young man, and it's not a community of, it's a very oppressed community, and it's not a group of people who see a lot of young men like him sort of be very, very promising. And I think, and let me just continue. So what happens is that then he becomes a representative of them. And so if you say anything against him, you're saying anything against them, because they see him as someone who's sort of bringing up the community. So when Miponi accuses him of rape, she's then pushed outside, and part of the problem that Naledi has is feeling that if she says something, then she'll also kind of be pushed outside of the community, because she's not following the plan, she's not getting on board, she's not part of the plan to have the community be brought up. So it's not a betrayal just of him, it's a betrayal of them. And so you can see his buddies are all just kind of, not our boy, other people have nothing to say about it, he's ours, he belongs to us, and she has nothing to say. She's an outsider who's trying to bring the whole community down. So I think that's what happens here. I mean, I can't speak for many other places, but this is.
But I mean, there's a strong thread also of, when you talk about victim blaming, this strong consciousness of being victimized, the potential to be stigmatized and victimized, also silences the victim. And the perpetrator is very well aware of that, and presents themselves as this perfect, upstanding, charming individual who has it all together, and everything's fine, everything works out fine. And the victim really feels the sense of, well, I've got to keep it together, or who's going to believe me? We have numerous cases of, this notion of rape in marriage, and obviously we'll chat about this, and the idea that, it's problematic to assume by virtue of the marriage contract, and this is the, inherent problem in the notion of, by virtue of the marriage contract, that sexual intercourse is consensual, and so what does rape not occur or cannot occur within the scope of a marriage? But even then, I mean, do you actually need the contract in order to configure how this relationship is construed? No means no. How do we break down these assumptions and these issues based on contractual kind of understanding and the politics around consent, especially?